to reading some stories late at night from the Reddit r/NoSleep. I'll read 3 tales for you, and depending on how this goes, we'll change whether or not I keep up with it. We'll start with a story from user Dana Ivy. A warning from the black-eyed girl. Ever since I was little, I have been able to see ghosts, demons, and the supernatural. I could never hear them or speak to them like my sister could. Because of this, I developed spectrophobia and fear of mirrors. I had a demon try to come through a mirror when I was a child. Thankfully, my father destroyed the mirror when he heard me scream. I grew up and gotten used to spirits being in my home, and around me. It came no surprise when I joined the Navy that my ship was haunted. I got my first apartment and started dating this guy who was also in the Navy. He was a pagan and taught me about the occult. Unfortunately, he turned into an emotionally abusive jerk. I had, and still do, have very low self-esteem. I was a loner growing up, never had friends. Then I joined the military and was stationed in Virginia, where again I did not know anyone. Sadly, due to this, I was naive to a lot of things, including relationships. I was used to men being jerks to me, because those types were drawn to me, and I would believe they were nice guys till they would show their real colors. Sorry, I digress. While dating a certain guy whose name I will not say, he lived in my apartment, and for 2 years there were no ghosts or supernatural in my home. I saw them on my ship all the time, but not in my home, or in mirrors. I later found out he had put a barrier over my place to keep out all of them. I finally got the courage to leave him after 2 years of his abuse. He pulled a gun on me and placed it to my head. Pulling the trigger, he started laughing. The gun was not loaded, but I was so miserable at the time I wouldn't have cared if it was. After he moved out, I noticed my place had a different feel to it. A friend of mine who was also pagan examined my home and told me about the barrier my ex had created. He took me to an occult store and got me interested in studying the occult. I got into candle burning and druidism. I had finished my tour in the Navy, and my younger sister, who was in college in West Texas, invited me to come live with her. She needed help with rent, and I needed a place to stay. My sister knew all about my ex and bad relationships of my past. She was horrified when I told her what he had done. I was still healing from our relationship. I was angry and upset, so I pulled out my candle burning altar and decided to try my hand on a spell or two. I had found 2 that I wish I had never done. One was to rid yourself of the pain, and the other was to rid of the person from your life. Well, of course, I wanted this jerk gone from this world. Never wanted to hear his name or see him on social media again. Performing these spells, I felt better and went to sleep. It was maybe 3 in the morning. I was suddenly awoken. Standing there next to me was a young girl. She was wearing a black dress that looked from the Victorian era. She had long white hair, pale skin, and black eyes. She was holding a black rose. She stared at me, not saying a word, just holding the rose to her chest and scowling at me. I'm not gonna lie, it freaked me out to no end. I started screaming. The girl cocked her head to the side and threw the rose on my bed. My younger sister ran into the room because I was screaming. She said it was the most blood-curdling scream she had ever heard. When I told her about the girl, she turned pale. She asked me if I had done anything to warrant such a visit. After I told her what I had done earlier, she became so angry with me. She had been studying the supernatural as well because she wanted to know why our family had this connection, being able to see and hear them. Unlike me, she could hear and talk to them like my father. My sister explained that the girl was a warning, that I was messing with something I should not be messing with. Essentially, don't poke the bear. After that night, I packed my stuff up and swore not to try my hand at that again. It really had scared me. For the next few days, I saw her in the mirror standing behind me, always cocking her head to the side, watching, waiting. My fear of mirrors intensified. I would refuse to look in one after that. The years went by. I moved to Central Texas to attend my grad school. I was studying to become a therapist to work with veterans. While in school, had a small retail job. No, I will not give the name of the store because it is well known. I had forgotten about my encounter with the girl and just went back to normal. While working at the store, the manager took a liking to me. Looking back, I was a fool to have dated these men in my past, but again, I was naive and lonely. With the exception of my sister and my old Navy friend, I did not have anyone to really talk to. My sister was living in Arizona. My friend, he was in Missouri. Well, I started messing around with this guy. We always worked the same shift, and my apartment was close by, so we would hang out in my place after work. I always worked the night shift, eating him in the Navy. I was socially awkward, and night shift there was less people to be cruel to me. Things were okay until New Year's Day. My phone started blowing up from a blocked number. I swear it had to have rung almost 20 times before I finally picked it up. On the other end was the manager's wife screaming at me for messing with her husband. I was shocked because the guy did not wear a wedding ring, nor had he told me he had a wife. After she threatened me and cursed me out, I reluctantly went to work my shift. I was so glad he was not working that night. After my shift, I told my coworker that I had quit and handed in my name tag. As I walked out to my car, I saw it had been keyed. I assumed it was the angry wife. She knew who I was and where I worked. I was seething as I drove home. When I got home, I was angry and crying. That was when I remembered my candle burning. The manager had also been into the occult, so I showed him my candle burning books and altar. I pulled out the spell, wishing him removed from my life in this world. That night, I was awoken. I was cold and sweating. It doesn't get that cold in Central Texas, so I could not understand why I was freezing until I turned to the side. There, standing next to my bed, was the black-eyed girl. She was dressed the same in the black Victorian dress and held a black rose. She again was scowling at me. I froze in fear. It had been years since I'd seen her. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. I could only watch. For the first time, I heard a ghost speak to me. She glared at me and opened her mouth, speaking in a commanding voice. She said, "I warned you once. I'm warning you again. There will not be a third." After she said that, she threw a rose onto my bed and walked out of my bedroom. I did not sleep for the rest of the night. Like she had the first time, I saw her for the next several days in the mirrors. I told my sister about it the next day, and she was yelling at me for a good hour. I have since locked up my candle burning altar. It had been over 10 years since I had seen the black-eyed girl. I still have a fear of mirrors and still see ghosts walking around. Looking back on my past, I can see how dumb I was. I still feel she is always looking nearby, especially when I want to wish ill will upon someone. That's the end of that one. We'll go for this next one, posted by user Saturdead. The title, "There's Something Wrong with My Blood." I grew up in a small community in the south of Minnesota called St. Gall. We were 8 families, all loosely related. Uncles and aunts from both sides of my family, along with grandparents and 2 outsider families, not directly related by blood. It was a remnant of the hippie era, and my mother grew up out here. It was originally meant to be some sort of farming commune for people who wanted to live on their own terms without going completely off the grid. It isn't like a religious gathering or a cult as many believe. It was all about a different way of life and living closer to the earth. My mother left St. Gall for a year to study sociology, and that's where she met my dad. I was an accidental pregnancy, and my dad didn't want to stick around. My mother moved back to St. Gall and had me in the early 90s. I was born in the house I grew up in. Life out in St. Gall wasn't as odd as one might think. I still went to school, I just had to take an earlier bus. We still went into town at least once a week, and I had many friends that I got really close to over the years. Still, there was always that air of being different around me. My mom explained that a lot of the parents of the kids at school didn't like people from St. Gall because we were different, a bit odd. My mom was terrified of a lot of things, but mostly blood. That was her number one fear, and if I ever hurt myself, she would try to cover it up as fast as possible. It was strange because I saw kids skin their knees at school all the time without anyone freaking out. I never hurt myself like that since my mom was adamant about me being needlessly careful. It came to the point where I sometimes had to wear elbow knee guards to school, which landed me in plenty of trouble from bullies. When my childhood came and went, elementary school turned into a middle school, which turned into high school. Things got rough then, fast. On the best days, I was a Gaul kid, but most of the time they just called me Jesus Freak, cultist, Raven school shooter. I was branded an outsider without there ever really being a reason. I guess that's just what it's like being a teenager. I also refused to take the precautions my mother asked me to. I stopped wearing elbow and knee guards to gym class. My teacher had a deal where kids could come to the gym instead of playing team sports, but I was tired of being separated. I compromised with my mom by wearing several layers of clothes, but I usually just wait for her to get outside before I took something off. If she ever knew I was pretty good at both soccer and basketball, she'd have a heart attack. It was during those few first PE classes that I started noticing something was different about me. Sure, we were all growing up, but I was growing a bit different. I was almost completely hairless in comparison to the other boys, and my hair was growing lighter. I'd gone from brown hair to strawberry blonde in about 2 years. I'd also start to notice a weird smell coming from the other boys. They really stank. It took me several weeks to notice that they weren't actually the ones who was different. I was. They smelled like people who were supposed to smell. My sweat, on the other hand, was sweeter. Not necessarily in a good way, but just weirdly sweet by comparison. Not sugary, but more like the smell of thick dairy. I hadn't thought about it, I just figured that was the way sweat was supposed to smell. It wasn't. I'd made one friend in high school, Darren. Short guy who dropped in and went out of social cliques like it was his job. I talked to him about it and asked him to smell me. Weird, I know. And he agreed that something was off. He convinced me to talk to the school nurse, thinking it might be something like diabetes. I was scared he would tell someone about it, but he never did. Good guy. I had a long chat with the school nurse, Anita. She was very reassuring. Apparently, puberty can have all sorts of weird effects on the body. Sweet smell coming from your sweat was hardly the worst she'd ever seen. Or in this case, smelled. It was weird, sure, but this was a weird time to be a human. Still, she decided to run a few blood tests just to make sure my iron levels and white blood cells were okay. As soon as she poked the needle through my arm, she recoiled and crinkled her nose. The syringe dropped to the floor and I got up. She got a tissue and started to blow her nose repeatedly over and over. "What the hell was that?" she exclaimed. "What did you—" I had no idea what she was talking about. I looked at the drop of blood poking out my arm. I didn't notice anything on. I just put a band-aid on it while Anita tried to regain composure. Come back tomorrow," she coughed. "We'll talk more." But she was sick the next day. I felt uncomfortable with the whole thing, and I wanted to talk to my mom about it. But I also didn't want her to get worried. When you have someone in your life that is always on the breaking point, you make a habit out of stepping carefully. It took Nurse Anita the rest of the school week before she returned to her job. I was immediately summoned to the nurse's office. She had lost a lot of weight. A lot of it. She was drinking water from a large bottle when I got there, and she had dark markings around her eyes. She didn't seem well, but she lit up as she looked at me. Anita asked me for a new blood test, and I agreed. She lined up 4 syringes. Her hands were shaking, but she regained focus once the needle got closer to my arm. Step by step, she filled the syringes, but she seemed to get more and more excited as she did. I could swear she was sniffing my neck. The whole thing was weird, and I left as soon as she gave me a band-aid. She promised to run some tests and let me know as soon as she was done. She wanted me to return at least once a week for a checkup. Apparently, sweet-smelling sweat was a bigger deal than I had anticipated. I asked her if I should see a doctor, but she just shook her head. As I left the nurse's office, I looked back. She was standing in the doorway, staring at me from across the hall. Her eyes never left me. She was staring at my neck, drinking from a water bottle. This time I told my mother. I had no idea how much she would overreact. Instead of talking to Nurse Anita, she pulled me out of school the same day. She threw our entire lives into boxes, breaking at least half of our dinnerware in the process. In less than a weekend, she packed up everything and hired a truck. I barely had the time to hug my grandparents goodbye before we were out of town. I was forced to switch phone numbers, and my mother swore that if I didn't remove my social media accounts, she'd smash every touchscreen we owned. I'd never seen her like that before. I was terrified. That's how we ended up in Sabre, Michigan. Of course, my mom couldn't check on me all day long. I did get time to check in on my social media. Darren, still in disbelief about me leaving so soon, told me things had gotten weird at school. Nurse Anita had started asking questions about where I had moved, and when the principal couldn't reveal that information, she'd gotten aggressive. Police got involved, and it was revealed that she'd taken my blood samples home. Things got unclear at this point, but Darren, whose mom works at the sheriff's office, had spoken over to her about Nurse Anita apparently drinking blood straight from the syringes. But that wasn't all. In the days that followed, she was taken into custody. She was doing some sort of hunger strike and couldn't even keep down water. She actually died from dehydration, right there in the county jail. surrounded by paramedics trying to understand why our body was actively resisting an IV. By now, my mom and I had settled in a small 3-bedroom apartment. I confronted her about nursing Nia and what had happened. My mom finally opened up to me. "You know what capsaicin is?" she asked. "It's the thing in food, spicy food, that makes your tongue and throat hurt. It's kind of a self-defense thing that just is supposed to make us stay away." I'd heard about it and I was aware of the concept. This thing that is supposed to make us stay away just makes it more enticing. People can get addicted to it. To many, it has the opposite of the intended effect. It became something to be desired instead of something that protects the plant. Do you understand what I'm telling you? I sort of was. I didn't want to think I was, but I was. "Our family is different," she told me. "I was hoping this wouldn't happen to you, but it did, and we had to move." She really did try to bring me a normal life. She tried not to worry. Whatever it is, inside me was growing extremely potent. I started to understand why our family had lived isolated and why she wanted me to be careful around others. As a kid, it wasn't as dangerous, but as a teenager, it was stronger than ever. That's why even I was noticing my own smells. They'd gotten stronger. The years passed. My mom got a job at a gas station. I helped out as a farmhand and cherry picker. Things were going pretty well, all things considered, until last year. I was picking up my mom from the night shift early in the morning when a truck in the opposite lane ran a red light. We were hit. It wasn't a bad hit, but it was bad enough to send us into a spin and into a nearby ditch. Mom had been looking through her purse and smashed her head against the passenger window. I had bashed the steering wheel. The passenger side of the rear half of the car was folded like origami. I barely even remember what happened next. I remember the truck driver coming to check on our mom, only to drag her out on the pavement. I remember paramedics and a police car. I remember eyes looking at me, delirious and dark, open, bloody mouths, tendons snapping, a sweet flowery smell drowning out the gasoline pouring from the car. Red. I remember seeing a half-eaten face slowly being torn apart, eyes that used to comfort me having lost their light. A slack-jawed nightmare, having clothes and limbs torn apart and splayed on the concrete like a flattened toad. I don't remember much about getting away. I was chased through a field of weed and threw up in a water bucket next to a well. I hid in a barn and covered myself with hay to dampen the smell of my blood. I remember a flashlight passing over me as 3 people left, desperate looking somewhere else, bloody mouths still chewing. Pupils so large their eyes looked black. They were barely even breathing, their breaths so short I couldn't even see their chest moves. I had made it. I would never speak of this in person, as I don't want to risk anyone finding me. I've moved twice since that incident, and I'm starting to understand what I am. The problem is, I've started to get cataracts. I know it is an early stage, but it is definitely there, and it is progressing rapidly. I'm going to need surgery. Someone has to operate on me. I just fear I'll never wake up from that surgery. I have no idea what to do. I can't live like this, constantly fearing someone will get too close and catch a whiff of me. No wonder my mom had to leave my dad. No wonder she was always afraid. You're all hunting me. You just don't know it yet. Well, that is something interesting. Let's continue on. Alright. We have our next story by the user Weird Bryce Guy. And I'll never forget the time I was asked, "Are you human?" I was driving home from my brother's house when the road exploded a few meters in front of my truck. I'd been coasting along in that mindless, almost dissociative state that one inevitably enters when driving for prolonged periods. So my reaction to the sudden violence hadn't been quick or precise. I swerved wildly and much too late, nearly sent my vehicle careening into a gnarled tree that rested beside the road. I was only saved from subsequently spiraling out of control or flipping the truck by the otherwise flat desolation of the area. The tree had been the only object I'd consciously noticed for miles, the only other thing that needed to be avoided. I eventually came to a stop off the road, and after I recovered from the shocking and abrupt return to total awareness, I looked into the rearview mirror. Surprisingly, I saw nothing but the smoldering spot on the road where the explosion had occurred. My first thoughts were, of course, that a meteorite had fallen, some remnant of a celestial object that had endured the harrowing passage through Earth's atmosphere. Then, in capitalistic, opportunistic advancement from this thought, I wondered if such an object would be valuable. I would have left my truck and gone over to investigate, but before I could even grip my door handle, I saw something approaching me, something that shined brilliantly in the sun-bathed expanse and moved unsettlingly fast. Those primarily engraved instantly Sorry, hang on. Those primarily engraved, instantly reactivated instincts flared to action. Before I even consciously regarded the unknown thing as a threat, I was putting my foot to the pedal and speeding across the plain towards it. Looking back, my brain obviously chose the fight option in the off-sided fight or flight binary, and while I am ultimately thankful for that unconscious choice, I wonder what would have happened if I had tried to flee. I wonder if I would have been able to, even with a vehicle. I wasn't able to reconcile its finer features against the equally bright backdrop until it was nearly right in front of me. Had I been given a clear view of it sooner, I might have lost my nerve and acted differently. But the visual ignorance compelled me on, and by the time I got a good look at it in human form, it was too late to stomp the brake or veer away. I slammed into the thing at 50 miles per hour and kept going, but not through any sort of willful determination. The fear that arose at the sight of the thing had immediately totally petrified me. I wouldn't have been able to move my foot if I had wanted to. Giving further evidence to its humanity, the thing hadn't crumpled beneath the truck or been blasted to bits by the impact. It held onto the grill with one arm, while the other leveled a weapon of some kind with robotic steadiness. Its body, morphologically humanoid but densely armored, seemed virtually unharmed by the collision. The face, an expressionless mask of white with two deeply set fiery spheres for eyes, glared at me through the windshield. I felt true terror upon meeting its gaze, a sudden and deep vulnerability that went beyond a predator-prey relationship. Despite the obvious danger of the weapon, which I surmised at once had been the cause of the explosion, I feared those eyes in the moment more than anything. When the muzzle of the gun flared whitely, as if having suddenly grown incredibly hot, I slammed the brake, understanding that this third tiny sun before me had just declared itself the most dangerous thing. My unwanted and unquestionably murderous visitor was violently dislodged, landing several meters away from where the truck had eventually come to a stop. I knew not to expect the landing to be of any physical consequence to it, after having just witnessed it easily withstand a vehicular collision. My skidding tires had thrown up dust, quite a bit of dust. And against my nerves, I exited the vehicle to get a better view. I knew I was terribly vulnerable outside of it, but didn't want to be trapped inside if the hyper-lethal gunman fired through the small cloud. I stepped away from the truck, planning to exit the radius of the cloud and hopefully peer in from a comparatively safe vantage. My fears were confirmed a moment later when the truck suddenly exploded, and I was sent flying several feet away in the blast. I don't remember landing, but I do remember the immediate excruciating pain. The concerted agony of burns, bruises, and shock-rattled bones. I inhaled smoke and dust and tasted blood with every ragged, befouled breath. The world, once sunny and mundane, had become in an instant a tumultuous hellscape. Fire seemed to spread hungrily around me, like some hostile swarming presence. I managed to push myself up on my elbows. I tried to peer through the dismal umbrage of smoke. I had momentarily forgotten about my attacker, but the outline of a figure in the smoke quickly reminded me of how I'd come to be in such a horrible situation. You human? The thing's question wasn't absurd or even unexpected, considering its appearance in relation to mine. Its design was humanoid, but not human. Its figure shared some conceptual basis with a human being, but was not based on a human. Its body had the same number of limbs, but the proportions were all wrong. Longer, denser, jointed in ways that, to my basic eye, seemed better suited for combat than the human body ever could be, naturally or artificially. There was nothing that resembled flesh or hide. Its outer layer was entirely metallic, or armored with some aesthetically similar material. Its voice and manner of speech were oddly human, something that was never explained, and I never had the opportunity to question. You haven't perished. Now answer my question. Are you a human? A member of that species which possesses an indwelling soul? The latter portion of this question did take me by surprise, and I even briefly forgot the pain that plagued every inch of my body. I coughed out some pulmonary obstruction and responded that I was indeed human. I had no thoughts as to what the thing's reaction to my answer might be. I had merely responded to forestall the violence that would assuredly been dealt to me in its frustration. Good. It's very good. I've come here from what you might refer to as deep space to take your soul. As you can probably tell, I am what you would call a machine. It was not endowed with a soul at the time of my creation. After exploring several worlds and encountering several civilizations, I was eventually made aware of one annoying thing: that humans, for whatever reason, are the only species in existence to possess a soul. Sure, there are species more complex than yours, civilizations far more sophisticated, but only you creatures possess that unique spirit, that phenomenon wholly separate from mind and body. I want it, I've killed for it, and I'm going to take it. I'm sure it would have killed me then, blasted with its weapon and somehow extracted my soul from the charred flesh. But before it could, before the weapon's muzzle burned white hot, something leapt through the dust and collided with the soul-seeking machine. The two things, now enveloped in the dust cloud, struggled against each other. The smaller of the two latched onto the machine's body. I could tell through the haze and even my blurred vision that some sort of animal fought against the machine, but it was impossible to identify exactly what kind of animal through the darkly beclouded atmosphere. After a few seconds of struggling, I had heard something clatter against a rocky surface, and despite my injuries, I found myself crawling towards the source of the sound. By the next second, my hand had gripped the object, and I felt my heart flutter as I realized at once that I held the machine's devastating weapon. I turned towards the combatants, but still couldn't make out their forms clearly. Before I could ready a shot, I heard a heart-seeking, plainly bestial shriek, and the subsequent sound of something landing heavily onto the ground nearby. Almost completely unnerved, I steadied the weapon, trembling from the recurrent pain and overwhelming terror. But no figure emerged from the dust. Instead, the dust was abruptly blown away by a sudden rush of air, revealing the machine and some sort of spacecraft I hadn't noticed before. Rather than let the machine explain the craft or gloat about its victory against my own known ally, I fired the weapon. Its trigger was located roughly in the same spot as one would be on a handgun, although the weapon's general shape and power were obviously meant to be wielded by stronger hands. The kickback was immense. The weapon rocketed back and nearly smashed into my face. My shots missed the stationary machine by a wide degree, but did strike the craft behind it. This resulted in another explosion, albeit one much smaller. Having been on my knees at the time, and a considerable distance away from the craft, I was only knocked back onto my rear. The machine, however, was entirely enveloped in the blast. My arms shook uncontrollably, so I tossed the gun away, fearing that I'd accidentally discharge it and end up killing myself. It clouded away into the smoke, although I could still see the whitely blazing muzzle through the newly emergent haze. I sat there for a while, waiting for my shell-shocked body to stop trembling and hoping that whatever had come to my aid was not dead, even if it was some desert roving coyote who had attacked the machine for its own animal purposes and not to help me. When the smoke cleared a bit, I saw a fairly large crater a few meters ahead, wherein sat the viciously damaged craft. At first, I saw no signs of the machine, and almost had the foolishly optimistic thought that it had been entirely obliterated in the explosion. But when the flames that rimmed this crater died down to lowly embers, I descried a figure moving unsteadily within the depression. It had crawled halfway up the crater, battered and dented, but still operational. One eye aglow with that horrifying and darkly misanthropic malice that only a machine could feel. Its left arm, mangled beyond use, hung limply at its side. The right arm, scorched yet otherwise intact, held the weapon level with my head. Either it had retrieved the weapon I had thrown without my noticing, or it had equipped itself with another. Gouts of electricity surged from its damaged chassis, the exposed wiring sparkling and flaring with every movement. I couldn't help but wince at the devastation, couldn't help but empathize with the violence that had been wrought upon its body, imagining the same debilitation in my own flesh, ribs and lung, and entrails in place of machinery. It's not about what I want. It hasn't been about what I want for a long time. You couldn't possibly know the number of worlds I've burned through, the atrocities I've committed. There is no stopping now. There can't be. The only way for any of it to mean anything, the only way there can be any justification is all, as if I finished my task. To deny me that, to deny those lives that purpose. How could you? Its voice, erratically modulated, presumably due to the damage, sounded almost sorrowful, intoned with suggestions of a deep existential exhaustion. The weapon's barrel glowed, the final charge primed and ready to fire. I was weaponless, physically beaten, left without any means of defense against something that, with one shot, had destroyed an entire truck. The grass around me was ablaze. The air stunk of charred metal and scorched earth. The only thing I had left, the only thing of value I have ever had throughout the entire nightmarish experience, was my humanity, my soul. That grand difference that brought it across the cosmos of our planet. No other recourse. I tried my hand at dissuading it from pulling the trigger. Killing me taking my soul. It won't help you. That desperation you feel now, that undesirable, unfightable desire to fulfill your mission, it won't hurt you in the end. Once you take my soul, once you embrace humanity, you'll feel something you've never felt before. Regret. All the lives you've taken, all the worlds you've left dead and smoldering, they'll all come to haunt you. All at once. Even the most callous, black-hearted person has a limit. There is no sociopathy so severe that would allow galactic genocide to be personally digestible. You will hate yourself and your newfound, ill-gotten humanity. The only thing you can do now is walk away and hope that you never achieve even an approximation of the thing you think you want. Its remaining functional eye blinked, the light briefly dimming and returning to its fiery luster. The other, barely more than a hollow socket, glowed faintly behind the shattered lens. The fractured faceplate, expressionless and all the more sinister because of it, seemed to vibrate, as if the machinery of the artificial brain within was undergoing some exhaustive computational process. Seeing it like that, I realized that besides my spirit-stifling terror, beneath the trauma of the attack, I felt pity for the thing. Pitied its murderous yet woeful journey, and the undeniably innocent impetus behind it all, desire for a soul. It's not that easy. You ensouled at conception simply can't understand. When you've wrenched the life away from something, when you've stared into the eyes of a creature incapable of understanding why you were killing it, you'll know why I can't give up. If the price of a soul is the burden of their memory, the guilt of what I've done, then I'll gladly pay it. Those hollow beings, those incomplete spirits, will be whole within me. Its eye, focused into a small yet fiercely crimson dot. It leveled the gun at the center of my body. I tensed myself, preparing for the awful, agonizing end. But to my shock, it suddenly threw the gun away. The weapon slid across the blackened earth, coming to rest well beyond reach. The machine then emerged from the crater, coming to stand a few feet away from me. It was in a terrible state, barely able to remain upright, and yet there was a hidden or latent vitality about it, a resolve that, admittedly, seemed nearly as human as my own. It angled its body forward, positioning itself into a stance that was obviously combative, and said, "Here, now. Hand to hand, we decide the fate of mankind, the inheritance of its soul." I had let go of the broken arm I had been absent-mindedly cradling. It ignored the resultant pain as it felt impinged against my body. I took in deep breaths, wincing against what I was sure was a broken rib. My knees trembled, but there wasn't anything I could do about that. My vision, occluded by the smoke and the dirt and blood, was the least reliable of my senses, yet in the moment at the most important. I nodded, and the machine let out what sounded like a sigh of relief. Another attestation of its impartial or burgeoning humanity, since I doubt it had any actual respiratory systems. The fight lasted for 3 hits, 2 dealt by it, 1 by me. The motors in its arms had been damaged or jammed, as its punches were not the devastating, bone-crushing blows that I'm sure they would have ordinarily been. I shrugged off the first, which had been poorly aimed, intended for my head, but instead merely brushed my shoulder. The second hit true, but the target had been my stomach, and for once the fatty cushioning of my belly served a useful purpose. I barely felt the impact, which, had it been at full power, would have probably liquefied my visceral organs. I delivered my counterattack, my sole punch, with all the might I could muster, punch into what I had put all of my being, all of my soul, for the sake of Earth and mankind. My fist slammed into its chest plate, and my knuckles, irreparably damaged, embedded themselves within the machine's core. It let out a metallic shriek and fell back, and I fell with it, my mangled hand firmly lodged within the machinery of its chest. We landed together with its hard, dense body providing no cushioning for my fall. I rolled off it, winded and exhausted, yet still irrevocably anchored to its body by my hand. I had no energy left, nothing left to fight with, and waited for the agony of a severed hand, and the subsequent death blow, but after a few moments, only a static gurgle arose from the machine's voice box. I turned and saw that its head stared upwards, its eye much dimmer than before, the once infernal stare now no more than a tiny, fading orange dot. I've experienced something similar to death before, when there were more of me, a body, even. A refined one like mine can only take so much punishment before it shuts down and its core needs to be extracted and installed inside a new form. I've been extracted dozens of times in my conquests throughout the stars. I've fought creatures you couldn't hope to combat, powers beyond your world's combined military forces. I've endured through gauntlets and trials more arduous than anyone else has ever faced. I was more than determined. I was fanatical, maniacal. The soul, I wanted it so badly. Needed it. It raised its arm, flexed its fingers, and gripped the wrist of my trapped hand. Rather than crush my wrist, it caressed it with a gentleness that I wouldn't have thought possible. Power courses through me, blood through you, and yet both processes are physiologically, functionally similar. Our bodies are the machines of a different breed, but machine nonetheless. But beneath that, infused within your human cells, nailed to your spine, is a soul. Behind and beneath all this wiring and machinery is emptiness. An insatiable black emptiness has driven me away from my home, from my maker. It let go of my wrist, and with a violence that would have been unbearably gruesome if it were human, wrenched its head from its body. The arm, operating through some latent autonomy, cuffed the metal skull in what appeared to be a grisly display of self-admiration, as if a phantasmal head gazed upon the material one. The head was then tossed towards the scorched shuttle. From the neck sprouted several multi-jointed legs. The head raised and steadied itself on these newly grown appendages, which I'm sure had been housed within the cranial structure this entire time, and turned to face me. I'm going home. I'm tired of fighting. If tiredness is truly what I feel. As much as I'd like a soul, I'm starting to think it's not worth the effort. You can keep yours. You've earned it. Well, that body will self-destruct in 30 seconds. So I suggest you find a way to separate yourself from it. You better get out quick, too. The blast radius is 20 meters, and your legs don't look like they'll hold out much longer. The head then scampered into the opening in the shuttle. A few moments later, the vessel came to life, humming with activity. I would have questioned its ability to take off if I hadn't just seen how resourceful the machine was. I rolled over to mount the body, and with an effort drawn from the very reserves of my soul, pulled my hand from its chest. I knew, without any sort of magical training, that I'd never use it again. But before escaping the detonation, before the shuttle could take off, I shouted to the machine, "I need to know. Why didn't you kill me?" The head appeared in the opening, now hanging from the ceiling by cable connection that presumably allowed it to directly interface with the craft. It's ironic, I suppose. I realized that if I killed you, I'd feel the guilt of your death as well. And while I'm still sure I could bear the weight of all those other soulless lives I've taken, I'm not sure I could handle yours. The first being with a soul, the first victim who could truly understand what had been taken from him. It's not something that ever crossed my mind, not until you struck me. By all means, from my scans of your body, you should have had nothing left in you at all, no strength left with which to fight me, and yet you fought on anyway. You withstood my blows and even delivered one of your own. I realize now that humanity is shockingly formidable. Dust was then blown into the air, and a moment later the ship left smoothly off the ground. I watched as it quickly soared into the clouds, leaving a plume of whitish smoke in its wake. With what could have only been precious seconds, I hobbled away from the headless, forsaken body. I lost consciousness before hearing or feeling the explosion. I awoke as the sun began its skyward ascension, feeling as if I had undergone some debilitating gang initiation or prolonged car accident. My body ached fiercely, the smallest movements of my reawakening eliciting tremendous pain. The smoke of the previous night had dispersed, and the destruction somehow seemed less severe than the pleasantly warm night of the freshly risen sun. The ground was still burnt and blasted, but life still abounded beyond, and assuredly beneath. Luckily, providentially, I hadn't bled out, even though a sizable patch of dried blood had partially cemented my hand to the ground. I probably should have gotten up and gone to a hospital shortly after waking, but I lay there for at least an hour, soaking up the sunlight, filling up my tainted lungs with the fresh air, and I'd like to believe, feeling the life of the earth around me, begin its glacial recovery, and nearly lost consciousness again in my strangely blissful reverie. But was started back to awareness by the sensation of a tongue gently licking my cheek, and the pressure of a small furry body resting itself against my own. And that's it. Maybe next time we'll continue with more.